Hei! Før vi setter I gang, vil jeg bare si at I denne episoden har vi med oss professor Henrik Børsting Jacobsen som gjesteprogramleder. Det ble en veldig spennende samtale, så jeg håper du liker den.
Welcome to another episode of the Mind Body podcast. Today I have the pleasure of welcoming once again Professor now, Dan Quintana from the University of Oslo, where you're a professor of health psychology. And you're quite easily one of my favorite people to talk to about hormones and physiological regulation of hormones. And that's sort of why I invited you today, because I want to delve into this love hormone that is, on layman terms, called, and see what kind of new things we can learn about stress and stress regulation in the world of hormones. I am now Professor Henrik Jacobsen, and welcome, dear listener. This episode will be on English, but I hope it will be both captivating and easy to understand. So, Dan. Hi.
Hi. Great to be here again.
Yeah. Last time we spoke about HRV, and I would tell anyone to go and listen to that episode because it was fascinating. But that's sort of something you've studied for many years. But this is touching upon a completely different field of your expertise or study. And this hormone that I sort of teased about in the beginning is called oxytocin. So what exactly is oxytocin, Dan? And why is it referred to as a love hormone?
That's a really good question. Oxytocin is both a hormone and neuropeptide or neuromessenger. It is mainly produced in the brain, in the hypothalamus, which is a small structure at the base of your brain. If you were to kind of curl back your tongue as far as you can within your mouth, you would almost be touching the hypothalamus. It is about the size of a chickpea or an almond, and this mainly produces oxytocin. Okay. Oxytocin is a really versatile hormone because of its really amazing property that you can release oxytocin within the brain, but you can also release oxytocin throughout the body. So oxytocin is distributed within the brain and distributed throughout the body via the pituitary gland.
Okay.
And then under certain circumstances, it can be released. The body is full of oxytocin receptors. So one good way to think about it is oxytocin is the key, and these oxytocin receptors are the locks. And these things can unlock various processes around the brain and around the body. It was discovered about 100 years ago, almost by accident. Well, actually, it was discovered by accident. Like many things in science.
Yeah, like most cool things in science.
It was a complete accident. There was a researcher that was looking at the impact of various bodily fluids on muscle response. And as a control fluid, this researcher took some fluid from the pituitary gland. Like I mentioned before, the pituitary gland is where oxytocin is stored for release into the body. Okay. And he took some of this fluid as a control and dropped some on some uterine tissue of a cat, and noticed that this tissue just starts contracting. Okay. This is a really interesting property. And this led to the initial discovery that oxytocin was related to birth and then later on to breastfeeding. So These two things have been known for quite a while, which probably would definitely contribute to its label as the love hormone, which we'll go back to quite soon. But for a very, very long time, its role in childbirth and in breastfeeding has been known. It is absolutely critical for breastfeeding. No oxytocin, you simply can't release milk. They've animal studies where you've experimentally knocked out the oxytocin system. Milk is produced, but it can't be released.
Okay.
Yeah. Childbirth, it is possible without oxytocin. Obviously, childbirth is very important for the survival of our species, so our body has put in a number of redundancies. If you do knock out the oxytocin system, or if the oxytocin system is impaired, you can give birth with a bit more difficulty, but it is possible. But in terms of breastfeeding, it is absolutely critical. It's critical for these sorts of things. So given its important role in these maternal functions, this is what's contributed to its label as a love hormone. And for a very, very long time, it was known as a female hormone, given its role in childbirth and breastfeeding. This makes sense. Then a couple of decades ago, researchers began measuring oxytocin concentrations in blood, and as a control, they measured it in men. And they actually found that outside of the context of breastfeeding and childbirth, the levels were the same as women. And they thought this was a mistake. They're like, this has to be a mistake. Oh. It's a female hormone. But we know now that under normal conditions, peripheral concentrations or concentrations in the blood or in saliva or in the brain, under normal conditions outside of breastfeeding and childbirth, are relatively similar between males and females on average.
Okay, so you said so much fascinating stuff right there. So let's just walk it by and really simplify the first step. So you say that it has a storage facility in the brain that's called a pituitary gland, which is some of our listeners might be familiar with, and you give a beautiful example of how and where you can find that. And then from that storage facility, it sort of travels into the body by what kind of mechanism does it sort of flow into the body?
Essentially just via the circulatory system, via the blood.
Okay, so it's released in the blood via the brainstem, or?
It's released so the pituitary gland has access to the blood circulatory system.
Exactly, yeah.
And then it is, when it's needed or when it's released, then it is released into the bloodstream via the pituitary gland. So it is produced in the hypothalamus. It travels down the pituitary stalk, which is a couple of millimeters from the hypothalamus down to the pituitary. It's stored there, and when needed, then it's released. Importantly, it's also released directly into the brain as well. Sometimes at the same time, but not always, which has implications for research, which tends to measure. It's a lot easier to measure oxytocin in blood or in saliva than it is to collect brain fluid.
Exactly.
It's possible, but it's difficult.
Yeah, it would be the same, I guess, with cortisol. That follows along those same lines with transferring into the brain as well as the blood. But that's excellent, Dan. And you say that it's long been believed for maybe, I don't know, like the last 50 or 60 years, it was believed to be largely a female hormone.
Yeah.
And then this discovery of it also being readily available for men, and the sort of exception being the situation with breastfeeding, where it's expressed in large, I guess, larger amounts in the bloodstream.
Most definitely.
Yeah. And can you give us your understanding of what this hormone then does, if it's not just simply connected to maternal love and giving birth and feeding your child, which is in and by itself a whole another episode.
That's a whole episode. It's a very important part.
Yeah.
So we now have a situation where around 1905, first effects on breastfeeding and childbirth. For a very, very long time, that is all we think that it does. It's found in men. It was found in men, and it was kind of like, well, it's there. We don't know what it does, but it's there. Then in the 70s, there was the first research to actually suggest that it plays a role in behavior as well. Okay. So it's gone from purely a physiological reflex, so basically to help with childbirth. So essentially, it's quite common, or it's relatively common, if there is delay in childbirth, oxytocin is commonly administered because it has uterine stimulation. When I'm running my oxytocin intervention trials, I specifically check that people aren't pregnant, because obviously this can cause a problem, given that as the pregnancy ramps up, oxytocin receptors, again, the oxytocin is the key, the receptor is the lock, upregulate, or there's a lot of more oxytocin receptors on the uterus getting ready for birth. It ramps up, and as soon as it gets close to birth, it's really, really sensitive to oxytocin, and it contracts the uterus, which helps with childbirth.
So let me stop you, Dan. So for us that are dads, we've heard about this women being sort of catalyst into labor.
Yeah.
Do they do that with oxytocin, given that role that you described now? Would that be like the drug that they receive? Does that travel along the pathways of oxytocin or
it
impact those?
Not always.
No.
So essentially, it is always administered after birth as a way of reducing bleeding.
Okay.
That is clinical, that's normal procedure. Yeah. If there are delays with the birth, then oxytocin is administered to assist with childbirth.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. It's the Norwegian Express no sett i gang if you're delayed.
Yeah,
exactly. So I was just
no, it's good to clarify.
Side note, so fascinating. So when they discovered this role it has in behavior, what do you mean by that? Like, what was the first sort of inkling in terms of what it does in a behavioral sense?
It is also linked to maternal behavior. Well, that was the first discovery in maternal behavior. So for a very long time, researchers were fascinated by when you're looking at goats and sheep, they form a very intense bond with their mothers. The kid and the mother And it's crazy. You look at a flock of sheep, you're like, they all look the same. But somehow out of an entire flock of goats and sheep, they know who their kid is. And they form a very, very tight bond.
That's super cool. Yeah.
It's super cool. And they couldn't quite figure out what was the cause of this bond. And it wasn't until experimenters began manipulating oxytocin levels that they found out that, again, it was almost by accident. It was sort of like a throwaway comment. Oh, maybe this oxytocin, this birth hormone, has a role when it comes to bonding. And that's what set off a whole bunch of research in mammals to look at its role in maternal functions. Okay. This led to other research looking at rats, which found out that essentially virgin rats will ignore other rat pups. If you put them in a cage, they'll essentially ignore them or worse, become quite aggressive. However, if you administer oxytocin to these virgin rats, all of a sudden you actually start inducing maternal behaviors. So it almost seems like a switch is turned off to have these maternal behaviors. So for sheep and goats that have this bond, it's done this way. For rats, it sort of encourages huddling behavior and different stuff like that. So depending on what is normally done for the species, it brings upon this maternal behavior. So that was the next step going, okay, it's beyond physiology and it seems to be a part of maternal behaviors. And then researchers thought, what else does this hormone do?
Yeah, that's good research.
That's good research.
Yeah.
Evolution doesn't waste things like this. Lots of hormones and messengers are used for different types of functions. And they were thinking, what else does this oxytocin do? This was about the 80s and the 90s. And they began looking at things like stress was one thing. What role does this play in the stress response? These stress paradigms are quite common within animal research, and they're like, let's just give it a try. And then researchers began discovering ways that oxytocin is also involved in this stress response too. In parallel, things were quite quiet in terms of the human side of things. So for a very long time, it's like, yeah, maybe it's involved in sexual function. So in the 80s and 90s, they were looking at how oxytocin is released during sex and sexual activity.
In humans.
Yeah. And then nothing much was happening until 2005, where a study was published in Nature, very prestigious journal, which had the very attention-grabbing headline that oxytocin increases trust in humans. Within this particular study, they did an economic game where they can basically measure how much do you trust other people within this game. And within this particular study, it was reported that people that were administered oxytocin as a nasal spray versus placebo were more likely to be trusting. The reason that we give oxytocin as a nasal spray within our behavioral studies is that this is quite a large molecule compared to other molecules. If you take it within the blood, or if you take it as a tablet, for instance, it's not going to cross the blood-brain barrier. But the nose provides a back entrance into the brain. Your nose is heavily innervated by lots of capillaries and two main nerve systems which go into the brain, the trigeminal system and the olfactory, basically how you smell. If you administer molecules like oxytocin, these molecules can travel down these nerve pathways and increase oxytocin levels in the brain. So that is why we use these particular methods.
It's so much detail and richness in what you're saying. So I just want to break it down a little bit for myself and perhaps also for the audience. So when you say in 2005, this study that was fascinating, that it impacts trusting in people, and you administered this with a nasal spray, but how long is this effect, and how do you understand this molecule and how it impacts behavior? Is it like 15 minutes? Is it like a week? What is sort of the window of influence that it has in a person when you increase these levels? And also, is it bidirectional? Does it mean that when I trust, it sort of triggers oxytocin?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
Pharmacologically, in terms of the half-life, when we administer it intranasally, it has about a couple of minutes half-life in the blood.
Okay, so it's really quick.
It's really quick.
Wow.
But that's not to say, but if your body is continually producing oxytocin, then you could have this maintained level. But in terms of if you administer oxytocin intranasally, that oxytocin that you've administered only stays in the blood for a relatively short time. In the brain, it's a little bit longer, maybe closer to 10 minutes. The breakdown mechanisms in the brain are a little bit shorter. So experimentally, what we do is that we administer oxytocin and we wait about 40 minutes because we assume, and again, this is one thing we're not too sure about. We don't know exactly when the peak level is. We have a pretty good idea it's around 30 to 45 minutes after administration, probably reflecting the time that it takes to travel down these nerve pathways. And then we test these things and we think the window is about a half-hour window. Again, this is based on experimental evidence and evidence of when we actually collect levels in the brain and in the blood. And then we run our experiments. Perhaps there is an idea that if you administer oxytocin, sort of synthetic oxytocin, you actually kickstart the natural production of oxytocin. That is one of the potential mechanisms for why long-term oxytocin administration may have potential therapeutic benefits. Is that you administer oxytocin and it begins kickstarting the system so oxytocin is naturally produced and you could receive any potential benefits there.
And can you relate to the idea of like I guess my notion from this comes from my own field of study in pain, where you see this very clear effect of placebo and active drug. So you have a placebo effect and you have an effect from the drug. For instance, analgesic like morphine. You administer morphine, you have some drug effect and you have a placebo effect. But what's interesting in experimental research, you can sort of see this synergetic effect. Like when these two are combined, the effect is multiplied. So it's not additive. It's actually synergistic. It ups the ante, so to speak. And that's why I asked when you administer, let's say you spray me in the nose with oxytocin and you wait 30-40 minutes and I become more trusting or more in terms of bonding with other people. Now, what do you think about that reciprocity or that synergistic effect of behavior? Do you see that do you get where I'm going at? Is that kind of research been done in oxytocin, and can you speak to that?
Is this in terms of the placebo effect?
Yeah, or like if you. I hate that term, the placebo effect, because it's a very real effect, but it sort of makes it sound like a fake effect. But
it's real.
It has real effects. Yeah. So is that effect present in oxytocin? That kind of those kind of effects. So let's say I put a mood in a room with the sort of lights and colors and a very friendly person guiding the experiment. Will that impact as towards if I have an angry, like cold, distancing mood in the room? Would that impact the effects of the nasal spray and the oxytocin?
This is a really good question. I'm going to answer that in two parts.
So
sure. The first part is there certainly are expectancy effects for oxytocin.
Wow, yeah.
A really good demonstration of this was there was a trial done about 10 years ago looking at oxytocin as potential support for autistic children. And the effects were modest enough to sort of think, hey, this could be potential here. But then when they asked the parents, what did you actually think your child was administered, oxytocin or placebo? And they found that the parents that believed their child got oxytocin, the effects were the parent reported effects were so much stronger.
Wow.
It was that belief which actually increased that. When it comes to asking participants, older participants, what do you think you received? People can't guess beyond placebo. So there isn't those effects there, but there's a lot of expectancy effects. Related to that, one thing that's become clear in the research is that both the individual and the context matter when it comes to oxytocin's response. Oxytocin is not it's not exclusively a cuddly pro-social hormone. For a very long time, we had this trust study, which was later replicated in a much larger sample, and they found that it had no effects. So that original finding has actually been put into a little bit of doubt. But essentially, it was seen as this pro-social hormone. It's all positive. It's trust. It's hugging.
Bonding,
it's bonding.
Yeah.
And it does do those things. But then researchers began to look at, well, is it exclusively pro-social? What about emotions or behaviors which aren't necessarily pro-social? Somebody looked at this and evaluated its effects on envy. Envy is an important emotion, but it's not necessarily something we consider to be positive. Gloating thinking, another emotion.
Schadenfreude.
Yeah, Schadenfreude. So many times I've done this talk to German audiences, and I'm like, I'm about to say that word, and they're gonna judge me for not saying it correctly. Schadenfreude.
Yeah.
These effects are important emotions, but oxytocin actually amplifies that.
Exactly.
So it has effects on both positive and so-called negative emotions. So I think this is why I always smile when I hear this love hormone, this cuddle chemical. Yeah, it does those things, but it also has other roles. I think it'd be quite unique in an evolutionary sense for a hormone to be so exclusive to one thing.
Yeah.
It basically helps us with our current goals now. I think
that's fascinating, Dan. So I've heard the same about testosterone.
Okay.
Actually, that it has a similar sort of typology where you see this amplification of whatever need you have in the situation.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating, because this is why I always talk about this. When I speak about stress, it's so complex. Like, we're only talking about one peptide, one hormone here.
Yeah.
But it's so interconnected with all these other hormonal processes and other biological processes. So when I talk about stress, I always tend to talk about cortisol and adrenaline.
Yep.
But that's just because that's what's known as the two most typical stress hormones. And that's also why I find it so fascinating hearing you talk about this, because you always tell me, like, well, oxytocin is also a stress hormone in that way. It is regulated by and through our response in challenging situations.
Yeah.
So if we take that as a sort of a vantage point now, say that you have this intense amplifying effect also by oxytocin. What does that look like in a stressful situation? How does oxytocin come into play, so to speak, in that stress situation? So I'm thinking now, both in the acute and in the long term. So if you start with the acute term, where you have the stress response, this adrenaline release, as sort of well known to people, the icing in the belly and the fight or flight activation. Where do you see oxytocin fit in that sort of acute phase of the stress response?
So looking at both animal and human research, we see consistently that stressful situations, be them psychologically stressful or physical stress, exercise, for instance, consistently releases oxytocin. So there's a consistent release of oxytocin.
Dude, bro science. When people live together or work out together, they bond.
Yeah. There's a mechanism there. Physical exertion.
Yeah.
Mental stress. A very popular paradigm within psychology is the Trias social stress test.
Exactly. Yeah.
Where you get people to do a speech in front of people who are socially evaluated. That is one of the classic tests.
Absolutely.
Reliably, this increases oxytocin. In animal studies, stressing them in various ways, which you would never do with humans, but this releases oxytocin as well. So this is quite consistent, and it is thought that it actually has a buffering effect against stress hormones.
Okay.
A lot of the HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is important when it comes to our stress response, and the oxytocin system is orchestrated by the same region in the brain, back down to the hypothalamus, or the pulvoventricular nucleus within the hypothalamus. And when there's an experience of stress, as well as kicking off the HPA axis, then it also kicks off oxytocin release as a way to regulate, to basically dampen down and offset the stress response. So it's there. We, as you know, acutely, stress can be helpful, but of course you need to turn off the system. Oxytocin plays one role in turning off the system there because it's released consistently there.
That's so beautiful. So I get all these images of just like wisdom when I speak to people about stress regulation. I talk about the herd and the function of the herd. Like, humans are inherently herd animals, and this bonding aspect of oxytocin. If you sort of, I know you try to increase our mindset around oxytocin to not only be this cuddly love hormone, and I completely, with that in mind, I would still like to highlight this fascinating role that you talk about, where it actually dampens our stress response and could it also be that is part and play? This is speculative, of course, part and play in that why social interactions are one of the most powerful stress regulators that I often talk to people about. Like, they want to know, how do I regulate stress better? I was like, hug people, be around people that you care about, do stuff that you think is fun with other people.
Yeah,
that's one of the ways to shut down your stress response. So maybe I'm sort of simplifying too much or doing it, but I think it's.
I think you're on the right track here.
Yeah.
So let me walk through a really nice animal study which demonstrates this. Within oxytocin research, a very popular animal model that we use are prairie voles. These are little rodent-like creatures, and they're very unique in that they have they're socially monogamous. Like humans, they tend to mate together for life. They're not sexually exclusive like humans sometimes, but they're socially monogamous. They bond and they pair. So they represent a really nice model of how we understand human relationships. And oxytocin plays a really important role within these relationships within the prairie vole. There was a study done a couple of years ago where they socially stress a female prairie vole, and then afterwards they either left it alone or they put it back with its male partner. They found that various measures of stress hormones, for instance, after the stressor, when they're put with a male partner, they're a lot more relaxed. Stress hormones go down, blood pressure goes down, all these other factors. When they're alone, the stress continues. So that speaks to the importance of bonding in the stress response. But what they did was, afterwards, for some of these prairie voles, they experimentally knocked out the oxytocin system. When they did this, they did it again, and they stressed out these prairie voles, put it back with a male partner. It didn't work.
Wow.
So even being with their partner, it didn't actually reduce the stress response, which demonstrates the important role of oxytocin here. So one theory is that oxytocin contributes to this need for, some people have called it an approach hormone. So viewing it as either an approach hormone or withdrawal hormone, but oxytocin is an approach hormone. In some contexts, approach can be aggression, but in other contexts, approach can be what we traditionally seem to be bonding. Once oxytocin is released, it tends to increase our salience, or how much we notice social cues in the environment. So it's like a motivator to have social contact there. So this release that happens along with stress, it's been hypothesized, or people have suggested, it's a motivator for us, because it's one way that, in an evolutionary sense for humans and other animals as well, that we use in order to reduce stress, is being around others.
That's so cool, Dan. And this plays so nicely with the shadow part of oxytocin that you talk about, where it's an approach hormone. You say briefly there, but it's also aggression. It's also envy.
It can be.
It's also anger in a way. So that's super interesting, because that's something that I feel like isn't talked as much about in the stress response. It's sort of, okay, so you're regulating stress, so that means that you have to meditate, or you have to be happy, but some people actually regulate stress with anger. Like they get angry, and that sort of brings a release that brings down their stress system. So it's so important to remember the fundamental definitions, and I love that you call it an approach hormone.
Yeah,
that's like, when I talk about cortisol, I call it a metabolic hormone. It has the role of increasing energy. It's not a stress hormone. It has a role of increasing energy, and it's always present in us. It is multifaceted. It just simply doesn't drive the stress feeling or response. It's more a way for the body to have excess energy to solve things. And if oxytocin is sort of generalized into anything, it should be an approach hormone, which is a lovely image.
So that was a theory that was suggested about 5-10 years ago, which I think a lot of research is consistent with.
Are you now going to shut it down?
No. Partially.
I was so into it.
No. I agree with it. I'm not going to shut it down. I think it's too specific.
Yeah, it's too simple. Yeah.
This hormone is great for thinking about social behavior, but nothing broader. So more recently, a couple of years ago, I suggested a more broad theory.
Okay.
And this is called the allostatic theory of oxytocin.
Cool.
So
allostasis.
Allostasis. I thought you'd be.
Yeah.
So homeostasis is this idea that your physiology brings you back to a physiological set point.
Balance. Yeah.
You're responding to changes in the environment. Allostasis, as well as doing that, it also tries to predict future changes and adjusting accordingly. Looking at the research, I was thinking, how can this one hormone do so many things? And why does it seem to have a role in both behavior and physiology? And so much of the research, I looked at this through an evolutionary lens, through a developmental lens, through a mechanistic lens, but also through a, like, what is its purpose in its survival mechanisms? And so much of this stuff pointed to its ability to act like an allostatic hormone. Of course, you can make the argument that all hormones and all messages are allostatic in some sort of way, but
absolutely.
Given oxytocin's unique role of having receptors all through the body, its way that it can release oxytocin within the brain and also within the body, it's uniquely placed to orchestrate these responses to maintain allostasis, to provide activity when we need to actually, it's like an action hormone, sort of like this approach.
Okay, so that's super fascinating then. So did you relate this to sort of, now I'm bringing back to more well-known and possibly fallible theories of the hypothalamus, where you have this set value, set point value function of the hypothalamus, where it actually sort of regulates hunger, temperature, thirst, these kinds of things. How does that interplay with what you're saying? Because allostasis to me is a complex construct. So I try to explain it to people like, okay, so if you're in a hot place, like in your desert, your body actually starts to turn down its need for water. So you sweat profusely in the first couple of weeks or days, and then your body starts to adapt to that. And this is an image of allostasis. It means stability through change.
Yeah.
And if oxytocin is an allostatic hormone, does that mean that it has impact on these set points?
I think these set points can change over time. So essentially, pregnancy is a good example of these set points regulating. Yeah. So one paper title that I love from a couple of years ago, it says oxytocin does not stand alone, in that, sort of like you were mentioning with cortisol. These, because we like to experimentally isolate these hormones, we have this idea that these hormones work by themselves, but they don't. They work in concert with other hormones as well. So I'm not sure. I wouldn't say that oxytocin adjusts these set points, but it works with other hormones which do adjust these set points.
Exactly.
These set points change during pregnancy, most likely through the rise and fall of different sex hormones.
Yeah.
One thing that is very understudied within oxytocin, and it's probably the same with other hormonal research areas, is women. We look at the menstrual cycle. It's too hard. We're not going to do this. I think it's terrible. But this is what happens quite a lot. But only now we're actually realizing that it seems like sex hormones, particularly progesterone and estrogen, which fluctuate over the menstrual cycle, change how oxytocin works, because these things have differential impacts. So depending on the levels of sex hormones, testosterone as well, oxytocin works a little bit differently, which is fascinating. So oxytocin works within that different context. As I said before, the individual matters and the context matters. And quite often within these contexts, other hormonal systems are fluctuating, and oxytocin plays its role through those things.
You're sort of baffled by the complexity and the sheer scale of what is happening in your body at any given time. And I think that's part of the journey when I, in no shape or form, have gone so deeply into one hormone like you have. But I sort of did my PhD on cortisol, and I've been fascinated by this hormone. But it was also this sort of, I should say, I was disillusioned by the complexity in a manner.
I get
that. Because you sort of try to, first of all, when you try to measure it, it's like you said, it's easy to measure in the blood, it's easy to measure in saliva, even easy measured in the hair. But what's going on in the brain is much harder to understand and measure and gauge. And with cortisol, what I've found, which humbled me was when I understood its interplay with testosterone, for example, how these two interact. And when you give someone a drug, opiate, you regulate these hormones in a way, you blunt sort of some of the processes that occur naturally in the body. And this then really, really clear behavioral outcomes in patients. You could say loss of sex drive, loss of appetite, loss of a lot of things, right? And then that sort of brought me to think like, wow, I thought about testosterone and cortisol, but I haven't thought about insulin, which is super relevant for regulating blood sugar, and it plays a lot of things with cortisol. It's very specific. And then you come along and you say, oh, well, I study oxytocin. I'm like, Christ,
it's so complicated.
Yeah,
it's so complicated.
It's so complicated. But I think what you're saying is super interesting to frame it in this sort of evolutionary theory of allostasis. So if your body's and brain and physiology is designed to cope with challenges, it's perhaps the most helpful way to view these hormones are as our aids in this constant current of change and challenge, that they try to help us in a way, and is to call them the love hormone or call them the stress hormone is actually to do them a disservice, because that's not what they are. I think you put it brilliantly with break it down into allostatic hormones, more or less.
I quite like a description that I read a couple of years ago, that hormones work like traditional neurotransmitters, serotonin, for instance. You can consider them as whispered secrets between synapses, whereas hormones are public announcements. These things are spread all throughout the body and the brain to go, hey, something's different in the environment. We need to change something. And you can coordinate both physiology and behavior to do those things. And most hormones do that sort of stuff, and I think that's so fascinating. I don't want to study anything else. I could study hormones for the rest of my life, but it's just the fact that it can orchestrate things like this, I think is so fascinating. And the evolutionary aspect as well, like these things have been around for a very, very long time.
So let me like sort of start to bring this together. So what is your thoughts about oxytocin as a potential therapeutic aid? Like, I know you study this potential in autism and people with spectrum disorders, but if you bring this into the layman's world, to the public as a stress and mind-body podcast, what can a potential role be for people to sort of take home or think about when it comes to oxytocin in their everyday life?
One common paradigm, which I mentioned before, is the TRIA social stress test. So people have studied the impact of oxytocin on acute stress and found that administering oxytocin before these stressful events can actually blunt the stress hormone response. So
you don't get as stressed in the TRIA test.
Yeah, you don't get as stressed. What's interesting though is it's not we ask them, do you feel less stressed? They don't actually report they feel less stressed, but physiologically they do.
Yeah, exactly. I did this study back in 2014 where I did the group version of the TRIA test. And one of the things that I did there was quite fascinating was that I put blinders between people. So you actually
I've seen the video of this.
Yeah, you didn't give them the opportunity to actually interact with one another, and all they could see was me in the center. But that wasn't the point in this moment. But I think that involuntarily, maybe I then disrupted the functioning of oxytocin and the bonding aspect of it in a way. But never mind. The point was that these patients were pain patients, and burnout patients, and chronic fatigue patients, and they had this complete blunting of their cortisol response. But they said they were more stressed than the healthy volunteers. Like, they were super stressed by the test, but their physiology didn't act as if it was. So it maps perfectly what you're saying. Like, these hormones are public announcements, but our brain can still perceive things that are in complete sort of opposite of what the body is telling us. And that's fascinating to think about. So that's one thing. The other thing is this is the acute thing. What about the more chronic, long-term type of stress?
Probably the most convincing study I've seen is in the context of PTSD.
That's super interesting. People who have experienced trauma.
People who experience trauma. So there was a study done in the Netherlands about 5 years ago where the investigators were basically waiting at a hospital for people to come in after trauma. The majority were car accidents or some sort of accident in that sort of way, a traumatic event. And they offered people to participate in this trial. And then after this event, they either administered oxytocin for 8 days or they administered placebo for 8 days, looking at the effects on PTSD symptoms. I think it was the CAPS, maybe.
Yeah.
And they were looking at these symptoms. And what they found was that the people that came in who already had a high symptom load, oxytocin reduced symptoms 1 month and 3 months after this traumatic event. This wasn't found with the people that had mild PTSD symptoms, only the people that had high PTSD symptoms as well. The authors hypothesized that perhaps one of these effects was it actually helped encouraged more social bonding during this thing as a way to actually help with the coping. But regardless, they did see after 8 days of administration that this did actually reduce PTSD symptoms. So that was a really nice study that was done, quite a nice sample size. Would have been a very difficult study to run, but they got some really interesting results there in the context of PTSD.
That's so interesting, because PTSD as someone who has treated people with PTSD, is like, that's incredible if it can help people. Now, do you think the time window is of essence here? Like you said, they came in with a high symptom load, but what was the time from the traumatic event? Was it immediately after? Or
it was very close to. So they tried.
Do you think that matters in a way?
It could potentially in terms of memory processes.
Yeah, exactly.
As well.
Like the reconsolidation window of cortisol and everything. Yeah.
So it was thought that may have played a role there, given there's lots of oxytocin receptors within the hippocampus, which plays an important role. Plays an important role in memory. So they wanted to do this as soon as possible and to begin this 8-week treatment there. Yeah, that was a really cool finding.
And just finally, Dan, just for people who are now sitting, listening, and being fascinated by this hormone as we are, what does it feel like to do a nasal spray of oxytocin? And is there any sort of pitfalls or side effects? Why isn't this sort of implemented in a wider clinical context?
Well, we first need to figure out whether it works or not.
Yeah.
I know within Norway there is thousands of oxytocin prescriptions intranasally every year.
For people who are breastfeeding?
Mostly for people that are breastfeeding. So if you look at the data, the majority of these people, we don't know why it's being prescribed. It is only indicated for breastfeeding. Thousands of women. But you look at the data, hundreds and hundreds of men. We can assume that's not for breastfeeding. So these things are getting prescribed off-label, most likely for neurodevelopmental conditions or for psychiatric conditions as well. These things are already happening, but we don't know whether they work yet. It's important for us to actually do these investigations to figure out. So we have good preliminary evidence for this PTSD trial, but we need to get a better understanding of what dosage is best. We don't actually know what dosage is best. That's one thing we need to understand there too.
Yeah, and the timing of when and how long and how much. So what does it feel like, and does it have any sort of like side effects?
When we ask participants whether they got placebo or oxytocin, they can't guess beyond chance. So anecdotally, I haven't tried it myself, but anecdotally, people, you don't feel a rush. Some people do say they do, but that's an expectancy effect. You don't feel anything. The effects are quite subtle. So in that respect, there's no sort of feeling there. In terms of side effects, the systematic reviews have established, at least compared to placebo, that there is no clear side effects with oxytocin. We know this up to at least 6 months of administration. So people have done this for a very, very long time. I mean, any sort of intervention is associated with potential risks.
Exactly, yeah.
Within the PTSD trial, for instance, I think there was 5 adverse events, but most of them weren't even related to the oxytocin. And in the wider literature, they have concluded that compared to placebo, there are no differences there. Of course, an important consideration is making sure that participants aren't pregnant, because this can begin a birth, which we don't want. So within our trials, every menstruating participant gets a pregnancy test. This is something that's just we have to do.
Yeah.
Some people might have sensitivity to some of the substances within the spray. This is like a sensitivity to some preservatives, or if you have an allergy to latex, that may sort of cause some issues there. But generally speaking, the reviews suggest that compared to placebo, there's these adverse effects seem to be a low risk. But of course, we have to continue evaluating these things in terms of our trials any sort of adverse event, even if we don't think it's related, we have to report it to the medicines authority.
Of course,
these things are so carefully monitored, both within how it's normally prescribed for breastfeeding, but within trials. So we have to be really diligent with our reporting, which is a good thing. We have to understand the potential side effects for these things. So right now, it doesn't seem like there is, but of course, we have to continue monitoring these things.
That's so fascinating. So to me, this has been both enlightening and very interesting and exciting. I understand why you want to test this more and try to figure out what it does and cannot do. So I just want to end with a heartfelt thank you for coming and sharing your knowledge with us and enlightening people on this super cool hormone, which we now have renamed to the allostatic hormone.
It's great to be here. Thanks for chatting.
Thank you.